in many communities in Thailand, for example, they arrest some indigenous peoples who are still continuing with their rotational agriculture. They even have a law now where they have defined the carbon emissions that these shifting agriculturists emit, and they will be fined because of these carbon emissions. The most ridiculous thing I've ever heard in my life. I mean, my God, the industrial agriculture has 30% contribution to climate change emissions, to greenhouse gas emissions, and yet you penalize this small-scale agriculturists who have really sustained the systems. That is really, for me, something that was, I cannot imagine why they would go to that extent. So anyway, to end, I would just like to say that this is precisely why the indigenous peoples movements that we have been part of have really been pushing for the 4 Rs. We say 4 Rs, and this is reclaiming, recovery, restoration, and regeneration. We really think these 4 Rs are the things that will lead us towards sustaining and protecting the knowledge that we have had in terms of sustaining these ecosystems, and of course regenerating them and ensure that it transfers to the next generation. We believe that we have to, in this new world, this world where we are now, we really have to be more open already to pluralism or diversity, whether this is epistemic pluralism, we have different worldviews, we have different ways of analyzing situations and understanding situations, and we really have to foster and reinforce these different epistemologies. We also have, of course, to promote cultural diversity, because again, this is the basis of a lot of the continuing ecosystems, traditional livelihoods that we have. And we have worked in the Convention on Biological Diversity to put in the Aichi targets, the indicators of the vitality of indigenous languages, the indicators of land use and land use changes, and the indicators of traditional livelihoods. These are included as part of the indicators to measure, of course, the vitality of biodiversity. And recently, just now in the climate change negotiations, we also have been, I just came from Bangkok, actually, where there's negotiations are not moving very fast, but indigenous peoples have really, it was very heartwarming for me to finally see all the negotiators, whether from the developing countries or the developed countries, saying that safeguards are very important if RED is to be successful, that in recognizing the knowledge and rights of indigenous peoples and local communities is crucial, and of course ensuring their full and effective participation is also important. And I think for our for the agro-biodiversity, for conservation, or for whichever process that we have, the participation of indigenous peoples who have still the knowledge and the systems that will mean a lot in our move towards transformation should really be reinforced, nurtured, and strengthened. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Vicky. Continuing, I'm going to suggest a slight change in order, so I'm going to call Patrick first, if he doesn't object, to continue following up on when we had these calls from our first set of speakers for the need to listen, and engage more with farmers, and the need to move from support of kind of niche or niche products in agriculture that are somehow, are you hearing okay?
Yeah.
Niche products in agriculture to a more of a kind of a mainstreaming this transformation in agriculture. And we heard from Mr. Muller just now that we still are operating in a system where most of the incentives that farmers receive from market and public policy signals are incentivating exactly the wrong thing in general. So, we can see the size of this transformation. Now, Patrick, for those of you who don't know him, he's a farmer. He has spent many decades in the struggle to establish organic and sustainable standards in Britain and in Europe with the Soil Association, of which he's a former director. He's the founder of the Sustainable Food Trust. So he's in the middle of these debates. He's in the middle of all the great things that farmers can do. He's also deeply aware of the problems of farming. And over to you. How does this sound to you as a farmer, hearing all of us wanting to engage, needing to engage with farmers? What are we going to find?
Thank you very much, Ken, for inviting me to speak. And also thank you for convening this session, which it seems to me is of incredible importance and significance. So thank you very much to Christensen Fund for bringing us all together. With reference to some earlier remarks, perhaps I could be seen as a kind of emissary from a part of the agricultural sector. Not the whole of it, I hasten to add, because and I'll come to that in a moment. But in building this bridge, new chapter of collaboration between the conservation and agriculture movements, that is really the theme which I'd like to speak about, because I think it is of incredible importance. Ken has just made mention of my work over decades, actually, in the sustainable agriculture movement, working with a relatively small group, an expanding group of late, to try to build a platform for the development of more sustainable food systems. But I think for all the good work that we've done, in all honesty, we have failed to break through. And one of the reasons that we failed to break through is because of the absence of a business case for the more widespread adoption of sustainable food systems. And this is partly because of the mainstream agriculture being able to farm in such a way that they are not accountable for their externalities. There's been a failure to internalize the external costs, and as a result, the business case still leaves it being more profitable for exploitative industrial forms of agriculture from the kinds of farming systems that Johan was advocating, which are so badly needed. And another factor which I think has prevented the breakthrough, which will require political action in the end, both carrots and sticks. In other words, the introduction of measures which tax externalities at source and which provide incentives for farmers who adopt more sustainable systems, is the absence of a political enabling environment for those policies to be introduced by governments. And for that to be brought about, we need the help and the partnership of the conservation movement, because the conservation movement has enormous political influence, far more than the very small scale, until now, movement for sustainable agriculture. Our lobbying power compared to yours, I don't like to make this separation because we're all one really, is very limited, whereas the conservation movement has achieved membership whose numbers are extraordinary compared to the food movement. And yet until now, I would say that there has been, as was referred to by the Prince of Wales and others, this degree of separation of agendas between our two movements. And I think that that still persists today for understandable reasons. I've even heard some people here at this conference making reference to this, and I'd like to try to explain what I mean by that. I think there is a fabrication which is promoted as an orthodoxy, that in the face of the challenges that Alexander Muller referred to, the need to feed a peak population of 9 to 10 billion in the relatively short time we have available, also to address all the other challenges of climate change, resource depletion, and all the rest of it. The only way we are going to achieve that is with the mainstream farming systems which continue to use inputs which will continue to exceed planetary boundaries. And grown-up people who are in the real world do not really think that farming systems based on a radical change of approach, where you really do minimize the use of non-renewable inputs, where you phase out or largely phase out a 75% of production of the use of nitrogen fertilizer, I think Johan mentioned. Realistically, they're not going to feed the world or produce enough food to be viable to meet the mounting challenges of global population expansion. And I think there are people here.
So, I think you're saying that's a fallacy. Sorry, you may have not followed the length of his argument, but there's a body of thinking like that, but he thinks it's a fallacy.
That is, I think, the orthodoxy, and I'm not subscribing to that at all. But I think there are many people here who haven't got enough evidence at their fingertips to challenge that. And that moves on to what I want to say, which is that my experience, the other Ken mentioned I'm a farmer. I'm in my 40th year of adopting a farming system which has attempted, not perfectly, to move towards the kind of systems that Johan was advocating. In other words, I've used no nitrogen fertilizer for 40 years. I've not used any pesticides. I've used systems of crop rotation which attempt to build soil fertility, and we've tried to minimize our use of non-renewable external inputs. And my experience from the front line is that that system can actually work and build soil fertility and produce acceptable yields of crops. But again, Alexander Müller mentioned the absence of research in these farming systems, and Johan said that actually the need is so acute that all the existing sustainable food systems, including organic agriculture, the models of those systems, which my farming system has been based, are inadequate to meet the challenges which lie ahead. And I agree with that. So really my plea is that at this Congress and from this Congress, we build a new collaborative partnership of organizations in the conservation movement, of organizations in the sustainable food movement, but this also has to extend to mainstream agriculture organizations, where we recognize the depth of the challenge that we confront, the need for a fundamental change of practice, where the farming systems we adopt really do grasp these painful nettles of moving away from our umbilical dependence on inputs and moving to more truly sustainable systems. And as I said, my evidence, which I was going to illustrate with a series of photographs from my iPad, but unfortunately there's been another conspiracy which has failed. But I will have a private showing afterwards for anybody who would like to see them. It will illustrate some pictures of my farming system, which is dairy cows, cheese making, cereal production of self-sufficiency, and then I extended some other examples. One particular I would like to have shown was a project in Egypt at a place called Sekhem, where they, on a very large scale, are reclaiming desert using only compost and, of course, Nile water. And the results within 2 years are an extraordinary increase in biodiversity, particular bird populations, even raptors, which illustrate that if you get the farming system right, biodiversity can go in partnership. And this is also the point I wanted to make to you, that biodiversity can coexist by default with highly productive farming systems based on agro-ecological principles. This is not rocket science, it's something which happens naturally when you adopt the right systems. And I was also going to show another picture of taken on Howard Buffett's combine in the Midwest. Reference has also been made by Alexander Müller to the catastrophic impact of just a modest heat wave, relatively speaking, in the Midwest this year. And I was on Howard Buffett's combine in Illinois last September, looking at a very productive crop of genetically modified corn. But we now have reason to believe that those systems, based on a high degree of dependence on external inputs and hybrid seeds, are not going to be up to the challenge that we are all confronting. And I was going to end my slides with a picture of the White House garden and just make the point that although Michelle Obama is very keen, and privately probably the president is probably very keen, on the kind of farming systems that we all would like to see take the place of the existing ones, the balance of political climate is such that people in positions of political power are unable to encourage the carrots and sticks policy instruments which would bring about the transformation we need, because they lack the political force from informed public opinion. And this is where the conservation movement could play a critical role in creating this enabling environment. I believe that there are politicians out there throughout the world who would like to adopt these policies, but who are prevented from doing so by the combined power of the agrochemical lobby and the lack of pressure from their own electorates. So we need this new partnership, and I shall end on that note. Thank you.
Patrick, a call to action. Now, a moment ago you were talking about the degree to which biodiversity can thrive in certain kinds of agro-ecological contexts, and I think that's a perfect segue to our next speaker, Dr. Celia Harvey, who is Vice President of Global Change and Ecosystem Services at Conservation International, and as a research scientist has done a lot of work on biodiversity in different tropical agro-ecosystem contexts in Central America and elsewhere. And we're going to ask her really to answer the question, what do we know scientifically about the capacity of agricultural systems to sustain important biodiversity?
Okay, thank you very much, Ken, and thank you very much for the opportunity to be in this really exciting panel. I've really enjoyed it so far, and I hope I won't let you down with what follows. Conservation biologists have traditionally thought of agricultural landscapes, and particularly those landscapes in the tropics, agricultural tropical landscapes that is, as having very little, if any, value for biodiversity conservation. And however, that really is not the case. In recent years, there have been numerous studies showing that certain types of agricultural landscapes, those that are complex mosaics, those that are structurally and floristically complex, those that retain some level of connectivity, etc., can actually harbour significant levels of biodiversity and can play a really key role in conservation efforts. And I'd like to illustrate this by taking you to a particular landscape, the one shown here. So this is the landscape of Cañas in Costa Rica, in northwestern Costa Rica. It falls within the tropical dry forest ecosystem, which is the most endangered ecosystem in Mesoamerica. And as you can see, it's been converted to pasture. It was converted about 60 years ago, and it's been dominated ever since by cattle production, which is the main cultural and economic activity in the region. Now, when you first look at an aerial photograph of this landscape, you can see that it really is dominated by pasture. About 48% of the landscape is under pasture, and if you look, as you can see even from a distance, there's very little forest. The forest that's there is highly fragmented, is not very well connected, and in fact it only covers about 15% of the landscape. And if you look at the mean size of forest fragments, they're very small, a mean size of only 14 hectares. So if you were to look at this landscape, initially you'd say, what kind of value could this possibly have for biodiversity conservation? However, if you zoom in on this landscape, or if you start visiting it in person, you see that there's actually a lot of on-farm tree cover which often is not captured in your remote sensing analyses. What you see is that there are lots of riparian forests that crisscross the landscape and often connect the remaining forest fragments. You can see that farmers are leaving large numbers and diverse species richness of dispersed trees and pastures for cattle fodder, for timber, and for other products. And often farmers are leaving densities of 30 or 40 trees per hectare, and in our studies we found that farmers can leave up to 100 different tree species within their pastures. And in addition, many of the farmers are using live fences or hedgerows or windbreaks to delineate their properties and divide pastures. And so what you see is that actually at the farm level, you have a lot of on-farm diversity. And this on-farm tree diversity means you have the landscape is much more structurally and floristically complex. It's much more interconnected, and there's a high level of connectivity for forest species. And of course, all of this on-farm tree cover can serve as habitats and resources for wildlife. So if we ask ourselves, how important are these landscapes actually for biodiversity conservation, I think many of you will be surprised at what we actually have found. So we have conducted a lot of work on different taxonomic groups, and let me just show you a couple of results. What we found is that the agricultural landscape actually does conserve a considerable amount of the original biodiversity. So here you see we have 124 bird species using this landscape, 42 bat species, 37 dung beetle species, 60 butterfly species, and these numbers we know are very conservative estimates, because we know from our sampling that if we were to sample longer, we would have seen more species. We know that from the species area curves. Now, although the most common species we see in these landscapes are generalist species, a large number of them are what were previously thought of as forest species, and that is we thought they only occurred in forests, but that was because we hadn't looked in the agricultural landscapes. And in fact, many of the so-called forest species seem to persist very well in the agricultural landscape, even 60 years after they've been converted. Of course, if you are to compare this landscape to a protected area, you see that the agricultural landscape obviously has less biodiversity than the protected area. That's not surprising. Here you see in green the bars representing the Santa Rosa National Park, which is the same ecosystem located about 50 kilometers away. And what you can see is that the agricultural landscape, keeping in mind it's a fragmented, productive landscape under cattle production for 60 years, nevertheless still retains 68% of the bird species, 91% of the bat species, and you can see the other taxa there. So what this suggests is that agricultural landscapes that retain some level of forest cover, that even if the fragments are small, as long as they're connected, as long as there's a high level of on-farm tree diversity and cover and a high level of connectivity, these landscapes can be quite important for conservation. Now, these landscapes should certainly not be replacements for protected areas, as you can see they don't conserve all of the species. However, they can be very important complements to other conservation activities, and especially in landscapes such as this one, where we only have less than 2% of the original forest